The Achaemenid, or First Persian Empire, was one of the great dynasties of the ancient world. At its height, it stretched from Eastern Europe all the way to Western India, covering some 5.5 million square kilometers. The name Persian was adopted by modern-day historians to describe the ethnicity of its greatest ruler, Cyrus the Great. However, the ancient Persians referred to themselves as being part of the Achaemenid Empire. Around 4000 BCE, two nomadic tribes were starting to take root in the rich but hot Iranian plateau, the Medes in the north and the Persians in the south. As these tribes were nomadic, they were more interested in survival than conquest. As they became less nomadic, they had to learn how to farm, and in particular how to cultivate this fertile Iranian plateau. To do that, they needed a source of water. Had they not found that water source, and, more importantly, found a way to channel it to their crops and settlements, they would not have survived. They found this life-giving water not in rivers or lakes or oceans, but in the unlikeliest of places, rocks. Persia emerged out of nothing, a rugged, hostile terrain built with only invention and determination. Finding water meant travelling long distances. It fell to a hybrid engineer, geologist and diviner named Moagen to figure out how to bring it back to his people. Using nothing more than a stone chisel, Moagen would build the first cornerstone of the Persian Empire, a breakthrough system of underground irrigation canals. They began by harnessing gravity to exploit the natural topography of their land, which sloped relentlessly down from the mountains toward the Persian Gulf. Vertical shafts were first dug down from the surface, and the tunnel was excavated horizontally for a short distance. Then another vertical shaft was built approximately 3/4 of a mile up the slope, and the channel continued. The angle of the slope was crucial, 1 unit in elevation for every 100 on the horizontal. If it was too steep, it would erode the base of the water channel, and if too shallow, it would stop the water from moving to its intended destination. So 2,000 years before Rome's legendary aqueducts, the Persians were channeling massive amounts of water over massive distances in hot, dry climates, with minimal loss due to leakage or evaporation. Water meant food, and the engineering technology to receive that water was a carrot that the Persian dangled in front of their neighbours. Around 700 BCE, all of the Persian tribes became united under a single ruler named Achaemenid, who created a dynasty. The dynasty, known as the Achaemenid Empire, or the First Persian Empire, was to thrive and flourish under the leadership of a man who has come to be known throughout history as Cyrus the Great. Anshan was an ancient capital of Elam, the area roughly corresponding to the modern Iranian province of Khuzestan and the western part of Fars. The area had maintained a strong political and cultural identity while developing significant links with the neighbouring states to the west. In the mid-17th century BCE, Elam came into serious conflict with Assyria, resulting in a destructive invasion. In the disintegration resulting from the Assyrian victory, it appears that Anshan and the reaches of Elam in Fars became the political base of a new dynasty. This dynasty apparently began with a king named Tisp. He was succeeded by Cyrus I, who ruled between 600 and 580 BCE, and then Cambyses I, from 580 to 559. These first three rulers operated under the overlordship of the Medes. Cambyses was reportedly married to the daughter of Astyages, king of Media. The result of this union was the birth of Cambyses' son and successor, the future Cyrus the Great. Cyrus is believed to have been born around 600 BCE, so he would have been around 41 when he became the king of Anshan upon his father's death. The Anshan people were then still under Median lordship, so Cyrus was expected to operate as a vassal to the Medes. Not long after Cyrus became ruler, however, it appears that the Median king Astyages, who was Cyrus's grandfather, launched an attack against Cyrus. This prompted Cyrus to rise up in revolt. He was joined by the Median king's key military commander, a man named Harpagus, along with key members of the nobility. The war lasted for 3 years, finally resulting in the capture of Ecbatana. Contemporary chronicles reveal very little beyond the brutal facts of invasion and conquest. The Babylonian Chronicle restricts itself to a terse account of the final confrontation in the heartland of Media. According to the Chronicle, in 550 BCE, Astyages aggressively marched against Cyrus, but his army mutinied and surrendered him to the enemy, whereupon Cyrus marched to Ecbatana, the royal city. The silver, gold, goods and property, which he carried off as booty from Ecbatana, he took to Anshan. According to the Nabonidus Chronicle, Cyrus took his grandfather into captivity. Greek historian Herodotus tells us that the old man's life was spared and that Cyrus married his daughter Amytis. The marriage was a political expedient which pacified a number of vassal nations, including the Parthians, Bactrians and Saka. After defeating the Medes, Cyrus undertook a series of conquests in the east. These included the ancient Iranian civilization of Sogdiana, present-day Uzbekistan, Tajikistan and Kazakhstan. Sometime in the 540s, Cyrus also defeated the Lydian king Croesus, possibly linked to Astyages by marriage. The kingdom of Lydia was located east of ancient Ionia in the modern western Turkish provinces of Usak, Manisa and inland Izmir. The conquest of Lydia, being closest to the Mediterranean world, received the most attention from later Greek authors. Largely ignorant of the historic wealth and sophisticated city culture of the Assyrian and Babylonian kingdoms inherited by Cyrus, the Greeks attributed the Persian discovery of civilized and soft living to their takeover of the Lydian kingdom. The story was a fateful prelude to the later bruising encounters between the Greeks and the kings Darius I and Xerxes I, and was accordingly given prominence in Herodotus's epic account of the entire history of the Greek-Persian relations. The conquest of Lydia was sparked by an aggressive move on the part of the Lydians themselves. Their king, Croesus, attacked the Persian city of Pteria in Cappadocia, capturing it and enslaving its inhabitants. The resultant Battle of Pteria was a stalemate with heavy losses on both sides. The following day, Croesus withdrew back into his own kingdom and tried to gather together a coalition of his allies. Before they could come together, however, Cyrus invaded and the two armies met for a second time at the Battle of Thymbra. The Lydian army was almost twice the size of the Persians. According to the historian Xenophon, Cyrus had 196,000 men in total, compared to some 420,000 that made up the Lydian army. Yet the tactical superiority displayed by Cyrus was to win him a stunning victory on that day. Cyrus developed his troops with flanks, withdrawn in a square formation. Chariots, cavalry and infantry protected the flanks. Baggage camels were also used to create a barrier around the Persian archers. This had the added benefit that the odour of the camels upset the horses of the Lydian cavalry as they charged forward. By 540, though, Cyrus's attention had become clearly focused on the core of Babylonian power in Mesopotamia, the great city of Babylon itself. From this point on, Cyrus features prominently in Bible prophecy. In the book of Isaiah, written a century and a half before Cyrus was born, he is named as the ruler who would defeat Babylon and therefore pave the way for the release of the Jews held captive there, to return to Jerusalem. The scriptures refer to Cyrus being figuratively taken by the right hand by God to act as his anointed one. Being a pagan devotee of Zoroastrianism, Cyrus was likely unaware of the pivotal role he played in Bible prophecy. That prophecy had provided specific detail as to how the conquest of Babylon would be accomplished. The waters of the river Euphrates, which acted as a natural moat around the city, would be diverted, allowing the Persian army to wade through the waters, and that the city's gates would be left open, allowing for a sudden invasion and takeover of the city with virtually no resistance. Herodotus confirms that there was a deep, wide moat encompassing Babylon. Here is how he describes the siege of the city. Drawing off the river by a canal into the lake, the artificial lake said to have been made earlier by Queen Nitocris, which was till now a marsh, he made the stream to sink till its former channel could be forded. When this happened, the Persians who were posted with this intent made their way into Babylon by the channel of the Euphrates, which had now sunk about to the height of the middle of a man's thigh. Now if the Babylonians had known beforehand, or learnt what Cyrus was planning, they would have suffered the Persians to enter the city and brought them to a miserable end. For then they would have shut all the gates that opened on the river, and themselves mounted up onto the walls that ran along the river banks, and so caught their enemies as in a trap. But as it was, the Persians were upon them unawares, and by reason of the great size of the city, so say those who dwell there, those in the outer parts of it were overcome. Yet the dwellers in the middle part knew nothing of it. All this time they were dancing and making merry at a festival, till they learnt the truth but too well. Thus was Babylon then for the first time taken. Despite the apparently uncontested takeover of Babylon, it was 20 days before Cyrus made his official entry into Babylon. In 1879, an inscription in the form of a clay cylinder was unearthed that has become known as the Cyrus Cylinder. The cylinder contains the following inscription: I am Cyrus, king of the world, great king, legitimate king, king of Babylon, king of Sumer and Akkad, king of the four rims of the earth, son of Cambyses, Cambuzir, great king, king of Anshan, grandson of Cyrus I, descendant of Tisp, of a family which always exercised kingship. The Cyrus Cylinder goes on to denounce the deposed ruler of Babylon, King Nabonidus. This negative characterization of one's predecessor was a common strategy. The cylinder also describes the Babylonian god Marduk as searching the lands for a more suitable monarch. The black-headed people, Babylonians, whom he allowed his hands to overcome, he protected in justice and righteousness. Marduk, the great lord, looked with pleasure at his good deeds. He ordered him to go to Babylon. Like a friend and companion, he went by his side. He saved Babylon from its oppression. So it was that two gods, Jehovah of the Bible and Marduk of the Babylonians, were portrayed as using Cyrus as their instrument of divine judgment upon the Babylonians. The inhabitants of Babylon joyfully welcomed their liberator, who assumed the traditional titles of King of the Universe, Mighty King, King of Babylon, King of Sumer and Akkad, King of the Four Quarters, alongside his Anshanite identity. According to the cylinder, Cyrus literally left no stone unturned to take on the role of the virtuous restorer of the traditional material environment. He restored the gods' shrines and returned statues that had been gathered into Babylon as a protection against looting after battles to their temples throughout the countryside. After stating that the city wall and gates were renewed, Cyrus borrowed a further ideological tactic from his Babylonian predecessors, suggesting that his excavation in the city's foundations uncovered an ancient royal inscription. For the Babylonian kings, this kind of discovery of old layers and royal foundations was an affirmation of their continuing safeguard of the city. Cyrus's use, however, introduced a shrewd twist. His notable contact in the past, whose own inscriptions had influenced the style of the Cyrus Cylinder, is the Assyrian king Assurbanipal. He was a past restorer of the city, but also a foreign conqueror, not a native son. Having conquered the mighty Babylonians, Cyrus was now poised to dominate the Aryan world. Follow the continuing rise of the Achaemenid Empire in Part 2.